Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You are watching your operational briefing for April 2nd, 2026, and today we close the book on March and look ahead to what April needs to deliver. The March numbers are in: 17 settlements, 235 square kilometers, nearly half the February pace. We will give you an honest assessment of what drove that slowdown, where it was expected, where it was not, and crucially, why the first quarter cumulative picture still puts Russian forces approximately 300 square kilometers ahead of last year's pace at the same point. Direction by direction, we walk through what March actually produced versus what was forecast and what April realistically looks like. Sumy is the headline. Mala Korchakovka breached the second defensive line. The Sumy forest is 2 kilometers away, and foliage season is coming. Kharkiv was the one direction that held its February tempo exactly. Donetsk dropped the hardest, with Kostiantynivka and the Sloviansk direction as the bright spots. Lyman remains a May to June story. And then there is the political picture, Trump's Iran campaign, what it has actually achieved versus what was declared, the NATO fracture with France, Italy and Spain refusing base access, and what the choice between two bad options looks like from Washington right now. A full breakdown across every direction. Let us get into it. Another address by Donald Trump to the nation regarding Iran, along with his various statements, is honestly not something I have much desire to analyze in detail. Since they frequently contradict themselves, what concerns me at the moment is something different. I am referring to the drones that are flying through Baltic airspace and striking Russian territory. I have been asked on multiple occasions what an adequate response to this situation might look like. We are not considering extreme options such as nuclear scenarios. That obviously falls outside the bounds of reason. But what response could be considered proportionate? If the Baltic states have genuinely opened their airspace to Ukrainian drones, a logical question arises: what is stopping the same route from being used for Russian Geran drones headed toward Ukraine? In other words, if the airspace has been made available to one side, why could it not become an equally accessible transit corridor for the other? If Ukrainian drones are using this route, Russian ones could follow the same path. In that case, life in the Baltic states would become considerably more tense. Meanwhile, combat operations along the front line continue, and we continue to carefully monitor the situation. So as I promised in the previous edition, today we will summarize March. It must be acknowledged that the results turned out to be less than encouraging. Throughout the entire month, it was apparent that the tempo of the Russian army's advances had dropped significantly compared to January and February. Let us break this down in order. Traditionally, we will not limit ourselves solely to the March summary, but will also discuss what can be expected in April. We begin with Sumy Oblast. The main advances here in March took place on the Komarivka bridgehead and on the main bridgehead of the region. Looking at the situation at the start of the month, the Komarivka bridgehead appeared considerably more modest, but over the course of March it effectively doubled in size. The zone of control was expanded along the border, and the lateral advance amounted to approximately 15.5 kilometers. 3 border settlements were taken: Sopik, Potapivka, and Bilohiria, and control was established over a border crossing point. Overall, the result on this sector even exceeded the forecasts made at the beginning of the month. As for the main Sumy bridgehead, it had been expected that March would see the final resolution of the Kondratovka situation, but this did not happen. Yes, there was some advance inside the settlement, but full control was not restored. That said, a more significant event occurred: an advance southward from Alexiivka. The village of Mala Korchakovka was taken, and the distance to Sumy now stands at approximately 15 kilometers, while the Sumy forest massif is about 2 kilometers away. It is obvious that once the foliage season arrives, the forested terrain will become an important factor and will create favorable conditions for intensified operations. However, to achieve this, it is first necessary to consolidate inside the forest itself. An advance was also recorded in the Myropilia area. Entry into this large village was achieved, and a foothold was established, but further development will likely proceed at a slow, incremental pace given the dense residential construction. Rapid results here should not be expected. On the Krasnopilia direction, an advance from the south toward Lisny was observed. With a high degree of probability, in April the units of the northern grouping will be able to enter this settlement and possibly establish control over it. There is also a possibility of taking Novodnitrivka. Despite its apparent distance from the front line, according to available information, fighting is already underway directly within the village itself. Thus, in Sumy Oblast for March, Russian forces established control over 3 settlements and approximately 32 square kilometers of territory. For this direction, that is a perfectly respectable result. As for expectations for April, no large-scale changes are forecast. On the main bridgehead, the priority remains the final resolution of the Kondratovka situation, along with developing the offensive toward Korchakovka and possibly reaching the Sumy forest. On the Komarivka bridgehead, either further expansion in width or attempts to push deeper inland are likely. For the Krasnopilia district, the prospects have already been outlined. That is precisely where further changes can be expected. Moving on to Kharkiv Oblast. On the Lipsy bridgehead, throughout March fighting was conducted on the approaches to the village of Vesele, but entry into it was not achieved. Nevertheless, the sector along the border was somewhat expanded. On the Vovchansk direction, it had been expected that Verkhnya Pisarivka would be taken and an advance toward Losivka would be achieved, but the results proved more modest. Entry into Verkhnya Pisarivka was accomplished, but full control over the settlement has not yet been established. Changes also took place in March on the small bridgehead in the Dayton area. It was expanded and 2 settlements came under control, Krula and Pishchana. In April, the expansion of this sector will likely continue, and there are grounds to believe that Shabelna and Nestern will be taken. Additionally, a notable advance was recorded on the Milovsky bridgehead. Here, the village of Shevyakivka was taken, and an advance north of Ambane toward Katne was achieved. The zone of control was also expanded across a sector approximately 10 kilometers in length in the Otradne and Dvoraychanska areas, and the approaches to Kolodezny were reached. On the Kupiansk and Borova directions, no significant changes occurred. In Kupiansk, some minor positions were lost over the month, but the losses were minimal in character. On the Borova direction, the situation remained completely stable, with no shifts whatsoever. In total, in Kharkiv Oblast for March, 3 settlements and approximately 44 square kilometers of territory came under control, the same figures as in February. Thus, this sector of the front proved to be the only one where no decline in advance tempo was observed. Next is Luhansk Oblast, where no significant changes occurred over the month. In Donetsk Oblast, the situation is different. The decline in tempo here was pronounced, with the exception of one direction that we will discuss separately. On the Lyman direction, the main achievement was taking the urban-type settlement of Drobyshiv under control, a result that had not initially been expected. However, in Lyman itself, there have been no substantial developments yet. The sector remains extremely difficult, with high drone activity leading to casualties. Therefore, expectations for April here remain restrained. That said, much will depend on whether it proves possible to cut the Sloviansk-Lyman highway in the Staryi caravan area. If successful, the Ukrainian defensive posture could weaken substantially. However, it is more likely that the active phase of fighting for Lyman will come in May or early June. The most notable advance in Donetsk Oblast was observed on the Sloviansk direction. Here, a stable offensive tempo was maintained throughout the entire month. As a result, the westward advance amounted to between 4 and 6 kilometers. A good result given the difficult terrain and fortified positions. The settlements of Reznikov and Kaleniki were taken. South, on the Kramatorsk direction, Nikiforivka, Fedorivka Druha and Holubivka came under control. However, a counterattack was allowed to land in the Minkivka area, and part of the territory ended up in the so-called grey zone, which prevents speaking of full control. On the sector west of Chasiv Yar, the situation remains unchanged. The front line retains its previous configuration. On the Kostiantynivka direction, intense fighting continued throughout the entire month, both inside the city and on its approaches. As a result, it proved possible to break through Ukrainian defenses in the industrial zone of the city's central district and consolidate on a substantial sector. The zone of control on the approaches was also expanded. On the Druzhkivka direction, one settlement was taken over the month, while on the Dobropilia direction, activity remained limited. One of the key events of March was the establishment of control over Hryshine, which opens up significant prospects for April. It is expected that in the near term, Novoalexandrivka, Vasilivka and Mirn may be taken. Under favorable development, a northward thrust of 7 to 8 kilometers, all the way to Dobropilya, becomes possible. Overall in Donetsk oblast for March, 9 settlements and approximately 98.5 square kilometers of territory came under control. By comparison, in certain periods, Russian forces were taking 250 to 270 square kilometers per month, so the current slowdown is evident. In Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, no significant advances were recorded in March. Changes were limited to the Novopidhorodny area, where approximately 4.5 square kilometers were taken. In Zaporizhzhia Oblast, the east grouping faced serious pressure, but even under these conditions it managed to advance on isolated sectors, in particular west of Huliapol to a depth of up to 5 kilometers. On the Kharkiv direction from the south, the situation remained stable with no changes. On the Zaporizhzhia direction, control over Primorske was consolidated in March and an advance into Rishon was begun. In total in the region, 1 settlement and approximately 55 square kilometers of territory were taken. The overall picture for March is as follows. 17 settlements and 235 square kilometers came under control. This is almost twice less than in February, although February itself was a very successful month. Compared to the same period of the previous year, when approximately 250 square kilometers were taken, the current figures look comparable, if slightly lower. At the same time, due to the fact that January and February of the current year proved significantly more productive than the same months of the previous year, in cumulative terms for the first 3 months, January, February and March, the Russian army continues to demonstrate an advance over last year's pace of approximately 300 square kilometers. Further dynamics will of course depend on what results April and May bring. The question is whether it will prove possible to increase the offensive tempo, maintain it at the current level, or whether it will continue to decline. If the dynamic remains the same or deteriorates, then one can speak of a troubling trend. However, drawing definitive conclusions from a single month is premature, so it is necessary to wait for the April and May results. Personally, I believe that the April figures will nonetheless improve, and one can expect a figure in the range of 350 square kilometers for the month. Now let us move to an analysis of the political situation. Donald Trump is actively seeking to convince both the domestic American audience and the international community that the military operation against Iran is proceeding according to plan, and that in the near term, either some agreement will be reached with the Iranian leadership, even if that leadership exists only in the mind of the US president himself, or Tehran will suffer a complete defeat. However, if his statements produce any impression at all, it is rather one of the sense that the US administration is inadequately assessing the real situation in the Middle East. In reality, the picture taking shape increasingly resembles the largest political defeat of the United States since the Vietnam War, assuming, of course, that Washington fails to reverse the negative trends in the coming months. At the present moment, these trends are becoming ever more obvious. Iran has managed to withstand the pressure, has inflicted considerable damage on the United States, though it has itself suffered significant losses, and maintains its readiness to continue military operations. Moreover, Tehran has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz and established control over oil and gas exports from the Persian Gulf states. This circumstance is acutely sensitive for the United States, since control over this direction had previously been effectively in American hands. Thus, even having gained access to Venezuelan oil in January, the Trump administration has ultimately incurred far more serious energy losses in the Middle East. Against this backdrop, Donald Trump's declarations of victory over Iran, delivered as established fact from every platform, look peculiar at best. At the present moment, the situation more closely resembles a defeat that is compelling Washington to choose between unfavorable scenarios. The first option involves continuing strikes against Iran for some period of time, followed by an exit from the conflict under the pretext that the operation's objectives have been achieved. Iran's military potential has allegedly been destroyed, and the further fate of the Strait of Hormuz and oil supplies can be handed over to other interested parties. The alternative scenario involves a sharp escalation on the part of the United States, up to and including radical steps, including the theoretical possibility of nuclear weapons use. Though the probability of such a development remains low. The central question is which path Trump will choose and how Iran, having sensed its own resilience, will respond. Within NATO, serious disagreements have also emerged against the backdrop of the Iran conflict, effectively a mutiny of sorts. Several alliance members, including France, Italy, and Spain, refused to provide their airspace and military bases for use by the United States in the framework of the Middle Eastern operation. In response, the US president stated that he would remember such behavior by his allies. In general, the course of events is quite predictable, and Trump's surprise looks somewhat unfounded. First, his administration applied pressure on the European Union, compelling it to agree to a trade arrangement more favorable to the United States. This was followed by attempts to establish control over Greenland, which belongs to Denmark. After that, the United States launched a military operation against Iran without coordinating its actions with European partners. In addition, Washington ceased the free supply of weapons to Ukraine, thereby increasing the financial burden on European countries. At the same time, allies were called upon to participate in ensuring control over the Strait of Hormuz. Under such conditions, the reaction from a number of NATO countries, including Madrid, Paris, and Rome, looks entirely predictable. However, this does not at all signify the disintegration of the alliance. NATO remains an extremely important instrument for the United States in maintaining military and political influence in Europe, and therefore, despite the contradictions that arise, it is difficult to imagine Washington voluntarily abandoning this structure. In turn, European countries are also not interested in stepping out from under the American security umbrella. Thus, relations between the United States and its European allies will likely continue to deteriorate. But a complete break in the foreseeable future remains unlikely.